Boragthong Earthlets, welcome to another 2000 AD, the Deep Dive episode. And I'm here with the host of the Deep Dive, my colleague Steve. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm good, Mike. How are yourself?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm looking forward to this one because the last episode went down really well. It was fantastic to hear yours and Sarah's thoughts on The Out, which is a fantastic series. On this one, we've got a fantastic guest, but a really interesting discussion. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the theme of this episode is going to be?
Yes. So this time around, we've got Anna Peppard, who is going to be talking to us about Devlin Waugh and the original Devlin Waugh stories as well by John Smith and Sean Phillips, Swimming in Blood, and a few of the stories around that as well.
Fantastic. I mean, personal favourites. Yeah, I was there when they came out in the magazine, and really looking forward to this. For those who don't know who Devlin Waugh is, do you want to have a crack at explaining Devlin Waugh?
When you have to explain Devlin, you have a long list of words that you say at random. So I would call him a vampire, exorcist, botanist, bodybuilder, mustache-wearing judge who travels the world being a bit of a dandy and causing trouble as much as he solves trouble, I would suggest. He is a bit of everything, is Devlin. He's completely mad. Isn't the comparison normally? He's Evelyn Waugh if Evelyn Waugh was a vampiric bodybuilder.
And an exorcist, of course.
And an exorcist, yes.
Yeah, that sums it up well. It's one of those things that with Devlin, he's a Dreadworld character. He exists in the world of Judge Dredd, and yet in many ways, and I've said this on In Orbit every Wednesday, he's kind of almost the anti-Dredd, the diametrically opposed opposite. So I'm really looking forward to this one. Particularly as Swimming in Blood is a series that's going to get some attention because we've got the Art of Sean Phillips book coming up later this year, which will feature so much of his early 2000 AD work, which, Swimming Blood is one of those, for me, it's like quintessential 1990s comics in that it's completely unhinged. The artwork has a combination of like collage, paint, watercolor wash over inks, pencils, and in the middle of it you've got this steroid addled libertine who looks like a cross between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Terry Thomas. So very much looking forward to this. Do let us know if there is a title or a character or a story that you'd like us to feature on the Deep Dive. In the meantime, I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of Steve. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about who your guest is on this episode, Steve?
Yes, so this is Dr. Anna Peppard. She is a scholar, writer, critic, editor, and podcaster. She's probably best known for her work with Sequential Scholars, but she's also been seen on websites like Comics XF, and she is the host of, what's this one called? It's called Gosh Golly Wow, which is a podcast following every issue of Excalibur by Chris Claremont and 2000 AD droid Alan Davis. She's incredible talent. She's far smarter than me. So this is a case of just trying not to get lapped by her as she talks about Devlin Waugh and masculinity and body image and all sorts of things. She's got a lot to say about this one.
Fantastic. Well, make sure that, number one, you enjoy this episode, Earthlets. Steve will be back with another deep dive in a month's time. In a couple of weeks, we are finally doing the creator tapes with Simon Bisley. Not even norovirus can stop us this time. Tempting fate somewhat. But don't forget that every Wednesday, myself and Chloe will be hosting In Orbit every Wednesday, where we talk not just about the week's prog and each month's Meg, but also have special guests and general chat about 2000 AD. Perfect way to start your thrill-powered Wednesday. So I'm going to leave you in Steve's hands and talking to Anna Peppard about the amazing Devlin Waugh.
Borag Fung Flutz, which is how we say hello in 2000 AD, ease. This is Steve Morris. I am joined for another one of our deep dives into the 2000 AD back catalogue. This is where we're picking out comics that people may have not heard of before or not had a chance to read, but I've always wanted to. And we kind of look at it with a modern perspective and see what we think of it in 2024, which is the year we're currently in. I remembered that first time. And today, we're joined by a very qualified candidate to talk about this particular comic. Anna Peppard is a writer, critic, and academic who is perhaps best known for work with Sequential Scholars, or for Comics XF, or for her podcast, Gosh Golly Wow, which is all about Excalibur and Chris Claremont's foray into British culture and comics. Anna, how are you? How are things?
I'm doing pretty well. Fresh in the wake of encountering Devlin Waugh for the first time, and that's a good place to be. So I'm very excited to talk about it with you today.
Well, you have a history of talking about British set comics with the podcast. Was Devlin someone you'd heard of before we mentioned this to you, or was he someone that came up at all in conversation when we were talking about Excalibur and Captain Britain and Alan Moore and all these sorts of things?
I will admit that my knowledge of British comics is definitely not as strong as it could be, despite doing a podcast about Excalibur. I mean, despite being set in the UK, Excalibur, Claremont's claim to being British is a little bit nebulous at best, although Alan Davis, of course, wrote and drew the series for much of its run as well. Much stronger claim to having his personality infused in that book. But yeah, I have read some 2000 AD things. I've read a wonderful book by Julia Round about Misty in British comics, which yes. I really, really enjoyed. And so I've got some general basic knowledge as a comics academic, but I would not say that my knowledge of British comics is as strong as it should be. You are the first person to introduce me to Devlin Waugh. You'd been trying to talk me into reading his adventures for some time, and when the opportunity to do this podcast came up, I always joke that I never read anything unless it's for work, since my hobbies and my work intersect so thoroughly. So making me discuss something on a podcast is a surefire way to actually get me to read something. So I'm grateful to you for that. Had a lot of thoughts about this comic.
What a comic to be talking about today, because this is the origin of Devlin Waugh. This is Swimming in Blood, which was first published in 1992 in Judge Dredd magazine 2.01, which is a numbering system I'm not quite sure I understand, but that's the official number. This is by writer John Smith, by artist Sean Phillips, and by letterer Steve Potter, and was told in the first 9 issues of Judge Dredd magazine. Anna, let's start off. I'd like to challenge you by saying, could you describe what even happens in this story?
So Devlin Waugh, who, as I understand it, is both a Catholic priest and sort of a Secret Service member of the Catholic Church. How would you describe Devlin? Is that sort of accurate?
It's getting there. Yeah. One thing with John Smith, I think for sure, is that he will give you an idea of something and he won't nail it down. You kind of have to do the work around what you think is true and what isn't true. So Devlin Waugh is actually, he works for the Vatican in the world of Judge Dredd. So he is living on the other side of the pond to Judge Dredd and all the people in Mega City 1. He is he's a bodybuilder. He is an exorcist. He is eventually a vampire. Yeah. He is also a keen flower arranger and bookworm. He likes watercolor paintings. He is probably the most prominent gay character in 2000 AD as a whole. And as far as I'm aware from my reading, Devlin Waugh is a judge working for the Vatican as a supernatural agent. So he takes on missions for the Catholic Church of the future, whatever form that might take, And when they tell him to go after vampires or mystics or anything that may be happening around the world, he is the person to take on the occult and the weird.
So in this particular comic, he is called in to help deal with a vampire infestation on an underwater, I should say, prison, colloquially known as Alcatraz, I believe, which excellent setup. I think you pitched me on that setup in your initial email about this podcast, and I was like, oh boy, that's a good premise. I am in for this premise, and I will say it did not disappoint.
Because the premise is a thing that it hooks you in immediately, but it is Devlin is the star of this thing right from the start. You know, he gets
as he says when he shows up, "My name is Waugh, Devlin Waugh. I'm here to steal the show."
And he does. He's only got in the first story, he's got a page at the start, page 2 at the end. Everything else is just explaining the situation. But from my mind, all you come away with is thinking, what a unique character Devlin Waugh is. I mean, when he first showed up, I mean, did you know he's part of Judge Dredd's world? Did you expect him to do this kind of thing? 2000 AD has got a particular, people think a particular thing about it. It's this kind of story. It's this kind of publication. Was this anything that you expected it to be?
I expect the unexpected from 2000 AD comics. The only time I've read a real bunch of them is on my previous podcast, 3-Panel Contrast. We did an episode about game comics, and I think we read some Nemesis and Warlock. Is that
Nemesis
something?
the Warlock? Yep, that's the one.
Yeah, that's the one. Read some of that, and there was a Judge Dredd story in there as well, in sort of a game book format kind of thing, where you have your choose your own kind of adventure kind of style thing, and that was sort of interesting. That was one of my only extensive sort of contacts with this universe. So I'm not going to talk too much about sort of the wider context of the universe. I mean, I do have some experience. I've read a book about Judge Dredd. One thing you need to know about me as an academic is that I've oftentimes read a book about something and then not read the actual thing, because that's what we do as academics. So yeah, I've read a book about Judge Dredd. I read the Sequart book all about Judge Dredd, and yet I have read much less actual Judge Dredd and 2000 AD content than I have read things about this content. So I mean, I've got some insight into the nature of this world, but yeah, that's sort of, I think one of the reasons you wanted to have me talk about this particular character was because I do a lot of research in representations of gender and sexuality in comics, and particularly in superhero comics. But also recently I taught a horror course partly all about vampires. So that had been on my mind as well. And certainly one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading this was, what are vampires doing in this text? What are they kind of symbolizing? And how does that fit in with some of the things that I know about this particular universe? I mean, maybe we'll talk about it at the end of our discussion, but kind of the stinger conclusion of what happens to the vampires after this vampire invasion was probably one of my favorite parts of this comic, and really gave me a sense of that ironic, satiric, critical quality that 2000 AD comics have, and the way that they sort of treat society and the way that they treat heroism too, because there aren't many heroes in this world. There are people who accomplish things and look cool doing it sometimes, but very few heroes to be had. And I've heard that is one of the obstacles for a lot of American comic book fans understanding a character like Judge Dredd, that they think that this character must be supposed to be a hero because he has some of the trappings of a superhero, and they don't understand that that's not the nature of the character. And I found myself thinking about that a lot as I was reading this, because I mean, what is Devlin, right? I mean, he has heroic moments. He's certainly not a hero, though, which, again, is interesting in context of that sexuality discussion, because you're thinking, when did this come out? Was it 1992 that it originally was serialized?
That's right, yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a time when it would be the same year, I think, that Marvel would have their first gay character in North Star. And I mean, we're still, in the AIDS epidemic at this point. This was not a time when we had a lot of gay representation in any media. I mean, certainly not any positive gay representation. So what I found interesting is that this isn't going for positive representation. I mean, he does steal the show. He is like a flamboyant, enjoyable character on that level, but certainly not a hero. Certainly not a respectability politics character. Like, certainly a character that's having a ton of fun with sexuality. And like, the frontispiece of this is an image of Devlin and Judge Dredd, where he's got like the nightstick that's, being his dick, like extending out from Devlin's body. So there's like this playfulness throughout, right? And the whole this particular series ends with him with some young boys in his parlor saying, can you close the door on your way out? So there's this playful, subversive energy throughout this, which is, I don't even know if I'd call it subversive, because that makes it seem like it's subtextual. It's textual. I mean, it's so obvious, which I think is part of what's exciting about this character. Like the Tom of Finland visual inspiration is just like hitting you over the head obvious. And that's partly what's exciting about it. But yeah, I found the sort of lack of embrace of any kind of respectability politics quite refreshing and interesting, coming when this comic does sort of in the history of comics. And again, a lot of my background is more sort of analyzing American comics. So I mean, where we were at in terms of American comics, mainstream comics at any rate in 1992 was maybe a bit different than you were at with British comics, but still this moment in sort of Western culture in general was not, I think it's fair to say, particularly friendly to LGBTQ plus folks. So seeing this character being so unapologetic in this moment was exciting. It was definitely one of the things I enjoyed.
And it has to be said that a lot of this is singularly John Smith as a writer. 2000 AD at the time of the 90s wasn't publishing a abundance of queer stories or using queer characters. John Smith on Devlin Waugh, this was one of the first major characters at all in British comics. From my knowledge, I am not an expert. But one thing that keeps coming across for me with John Smith, so just to give a very quick sort of biography of him, he came to 2000 AD writing Future Shocks, which are 5-page stories with a twist on the last page. It's the traditional way people get into 2000 AD is you submit an idea. If Fogg the Mighty likes it, he puts it in the comic, and then you can go from there. Devlin Waugh is actually John Smith's second stint with 2000 AD. So John Smith he had done comics like Tyranny Rex and Rogue Trooper. He did a comic called Indigo Prime. And then around this time, he went and did a few bits for DC Comics and Vertigo in particular, along with the British Invasion. And his contemporaries would have been people like Peter Milligan, Grant Morrison, Mark Millar, potentially. Those sorts of people, Sean Phillips, obviously, who he's worked with on this series. He didn't stay with DC particularly long at all. I think he wrote maybe one mini-series and 1 or 2 issues of Hellblazer. Then he came back to 2000 AD. And it's at that point that he wrote things like Devlin Waugh, Revere, Firekind, which I think he had the creative revolution from not breaking America, if that makes sense. He went to America. It wasn't something that I don't think he enjoyed or didn't work for him. So he came back to Britain and had this creative outlet, which was immense. And Devlin was one of these. And when you read something like Swimming Blood, the thing that comes across so strongly to me is this is a completely new bolt-on to the Judge Dredd world. Like, Devlin Waugh is not something that would have been thought to fit in with Judge Dredd. It would not be something that you'd think would be even a part of 2000 AD at this time. And yet, as soon as he shows up, he is such a cornerstone for readers. He immediately became one of the popular characters. He didn't get many stories after this for a while. He did a Judge Dredd. He met Judge Dredd in the next story, which is why you saw the nightstick cover, where Judge Dredd gives him a strip search, and he tries to get into Meg City 1 past Dredd's search. But with this particular story, I think the really interesting thing for me about how Smith writes him is that Smith is basically writing him as a self-obsessed, vainglorious person who doesn't care what is happening around him. He's got his interests, he's got his securities, whereas Judge Dredd is really obsessed with the law being correct, following the rule and power and structure like that. Devlin's pushing his power by not paying any attention to anyone else around him, by just going his own way, and everyone has to follow him or get left behind eaten by vampires or drowned. I mean, with his personality,
that's part of what's so exciting about the character, though, right? I mean, he's entering this world, and I mean, it's the genre mixing that you're kind of getting at too, right? It's not a character that you would necessarily expect to exist in this storyverse or this genre of story. I mean, it's like everybody else is in this horror vampire story, and he's in his own story. I mean, it's just like so much of it is thematized around that I'm here to steal the show. He's setting up his quarters with his watercolor paintings and being like, do we have time for cucumber sandwiches? And everyone else is like, yeah, there's like a bunch of like cockroaches that are instigating a vampire like epidemic on this ship. And this is crazy. And we're underwater. And he's like, we've still got time for cucumber sandwiches. I mean, he's in his own story, and that's sort of, yeah, the fact that he doesn't care, the fact that he's insistent on being his own unique identity within this genre that would otherwise try to subsume that identity or try to make it so that a character like this can't exist. And I mean, the fact that he alludes to the prior existence of himself in this universe as well. Like he brought up, that Smith drops all these hints that sort of require you to piece together the story. But there's the suggestion just on the opening pages that he's been in all of these, Doc Savage, Alan Quatermain style adventures, these pulp adventures previous to this. You could even have a fake editor's footnote that was like, see other comic that doesn't exist. And there's things like that dropped throughout, that he has this whole history that has led up to his appearance here, that we're supposed to be seeing the appearance of a famous character that we know before, except that it's his first appearance. And again, that's so wonderful if you think about this character as a queer character, as a gay character, being inserted into history and having this like dramatic, flamboyant presence. I mean, that's what makes me excited as this being sort of a representation of queerness.
And he is, at no point I don't think in the story does he actually say, here is my moment. I am a gay man. I have this history or that history. It's just something that is fed into the story and just exists within it, which I imagine is not something that was coming out around the time of other books being published. Like North Star is very much a, by the way, here's my big announcement. I am a gay character, and that was how it was. He came out. Devlin never says it. It's just obvious from the start. It's just really clear in the way it's portrayed, which I imagine, and again, I don't know if it's fair to say this, but John Smith is openly gay himself, and for a gay writer to be writing a gay character and just go, well, this is just who he is. I don't need to make it a moment. It's almost not a thing for representation. It's just, this character is this, and he's in this situation, so let's just move on with it, and let's just tell a story with him and have some fun.
There's sometimes I don't want to say misunderstanding, but like a simplification of how we understand what queer representation is. I'm using queer as like an umbrella term here. I think Devlin is very explicitly a gay character rather than necessarily a queer character, because there's a little bit of a difference there. But still, in terms of that umbrella term queerness, I mean, sometimes, again, when we're speaking from a respectability politics standpoint, we're like, oh, well, a character has to represent a cause effectively for political reasons, because this is still, gay rights remain tenuous. So there are reasons why people want to see quote unquote positive representation. But there can be like a queerness that's part of the structure of a story, right? And, the fact that he isn't sort of stating his identity, the fact that he's just here, once again, unashamedly performing that identity and like subverting the very genre that he's in through his impressive performance of identity. I mean, think about, he gets bitten by the vampire and he's like, oh, you're going to be one of us now. And he's like, you think that your vampire bite can erase my good breeding? No, thanks. I'm just going to incorporate this as part of myself. And I mean, he's just denying the rules of the space that he's in. And that's a form of queerness, because like queerness is, something that is contra straightness, so he's queering the genre that he's in through his presence. And I think that's, again, part of what I found really exciting and quite deliberate about this character, even though he's not out here doing the North Star thing of having a newspaper headline about his identity. It's just that queerness is threaded through the entire approach to this character and the way he interacts with this space and this genre and the other characters within the story.
What did you make of the idea of having his opening story be this one, which is set in the really confined space of the underwater prison, and to have vampires be the foe? As you mentioned, he gets bitten halfway through and just, whatever, it's fine. I'm a vampire now, I guess. I better just start drinking all this blood. In terms of how the story's, what did you think of that as the choice for him as in his opening salvo as a character, if that makes sense?
I was thinking a lot about sort of the technique of the compressed space and the claustrophobic space of the comic. I will say, and I don't mean this as a critique, more just of an observation, that I was expecting on some level to have sort of the claustrophobia of this water pressing down on everybody, the fact that they are trapped in here. I won't say that that's not emphasized by Phillips' art. I will say that I expected it to be emphasized a little bit more in sort of the construction of the layouts. I expected to see that claustrophobia sort of thematized in the construction of the layouts, and didn't necessarily feel that. I feel that there were a number of moments where you lost track of the fact that it was underwater. You certainly got the claustrophobia of these cramped hallways, these messy rooms. Everything is splattered with blood very quickly, right? Because this vampire invasion really gets going very quickly. So, I mean, you got that sense, right? But I do feel like I wish that I'd felt a little bit more of sort of the water pressing down on them. And there were some moments where I'm trying not to be too spoilery because I want people to read this and I have some of those shock elements. But there was a moment where I expected we were going to get vampire sharks, and we didn't. And I felt a little bit robbed. I felt a little bit cheated. I really thought we were going to get vampire sharks. And that's okay. That's okay. I mean, that said, Phillips' artwork is beautiful. I don't want to minimize that at all. It was definitely one of the things that impressed me so much when I was first flipping through and then reading it more carefully. But I think part of this is sort of a pacing issue having to do with the serialization as well. I think just the nature of the painted artwork, and because it's being presented to me, in more of a graphic novel format, I expected it to have that kind of graphic novel cohesion. But then when I'm thinking about it as serialized in the magazine, I can see how it would read a little bit differently in that context. Like, I think I was expecting, once again, that sort of visual narrative cohesiveness of a graphic novel, and expecting to see that sort of integrated into the consistent visual style. And that wasn't really what we get. But again, that's why it's more of an observation than a criticism, because I'm sort of reading this as what it isn't. I'm like putting expectations on this that it wasn't setting out to fulfill. So I think that's a little bit unfair on my part. But I do like some of the contrasts that he's doing with sort of like light and shadow rather. And there's a lot of, incorporation of teal and blue, and sort of this sort of like teal wash that he does on a lot of things to sort of give that sense of what's outside is water, right? Every window view is water. So it's not that we don't get that. I was expecting a little bit more of that crushing water claustrophobia of like a good submarine movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I suppose that's the balance of what Devlin himself is doing, because throughout the story, there's this idea that it's meant to be getting more tense, it's meant to get more dangerous for them. Devlin never treats it particularly as he's in threat or he's worried at all. So as a reader, you're dismissing a lot of what's going on around him. So when you see the stuff happening, the going through the sewers or getting caught or trapped by vampires in a room, it never feels like Devlin's going to be particularly troubled, and it doesn't feel like he really cares about any of the people he's with. So if they live or die, that doesn't really matter. So the stakes are not really there in terms of a story. It's just in terms of, and I suppose it's just like, what is Devlin going to do next? What is he going to say next? What's going to happen next? It's all about him. So there is that balance in there of the story loses a bit of power because Devlin is so overwhelming in it, almost.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, you have certain characters who are the audience surrogates in terms of them being more quote unquote, I'm saying normal. I don't mean normal in a queer straight sense. I mean normal in terms of this is how a normal person who's not a Catholic vampire exorcist might respond to this situation. Because, you have the exterminator guy who's present throughout. He was originally brought in to deal with the cockroach problem. And then, of course, that becomes a much bigger problem very quickly. He's often kind of this voice of reason. He's like, well, we can't leave these mutants behind. We have to try to help them. And then the prison guards are like, are you crazy? Shut that lid. We're not going down there to deal with those monsters, that kind of thing. I mean, he's the one who tries to save some of the female nurses who, are part of this little attempted escape mission and stuff, doing some of the quote unquote heroic actions that you would expect this sort of quote unquote heroic male character to do in this space. And I did find it interesting that it was that character that he chooses to give some of those moments to. It's not the prison guards, it's not Devlin. It's, this working class guy who came to deal with the roach problem, who gets some of the more traditional heroic moments. Because, I mean, there's a whole class thing going on here, obviously, with, I mentioned the comment about like what vampires do earlier, right? So what do they do in this particular story? I mean, it's the literalization of the way the prison industrial complex reduces people to flesh, to meat. I mean, that's part of what's going on here. The lack of care that these outside authorities have for the situation. And I would love to talk about the ending, but I kind of don't want to, because I don't want to spoil the ending for readers. But yeah, it doesn't end how I expected, and I definitely thought that was one of the strengths of the story as a whole.
Because Devlin does, obviously he survives for another day. Whatever happens to other people, you'll have to read the story to find out, I suppose. But when you got to the end of this, was this, a good introduction to Devlin? Was it something where you read it and thought, okay, I'm ready, I could read more of him, or did it feel like a full point for you, a full stop for you? Like, could you be happy now not reading any more Devlin, or would you be just getting on and trying more of his stories, do you think?
I would definitely be interested in checking out more of Devlin's stories. This is an excellent setup for this character. Again, with those teases of like his expansive adventures beyond this comic, it practically begs to see more of those stories told. But also the setup here, if he becomes a vampire, how is that going to affect this character? I mean, again, the amount of genre mixing and genre blending already going on here, and that he cranks that up to 11 by introducing, oh, he's also a vampire now. I mean, It just begs for more stories. It's an excellent introduction to this character, I would say.
Oh, good. Well, if you want to read Devlin Waugh, Story Ring Blood, the best way to do it is probably by getting the Best of 2000 AD Volume 5, which has the entirety of the story included in part of it, alongside several other 2000 AD stories, past and present. Anna, we're coming to the end of our time already, which is absolutely mad. Anna, thank you so much for coming on to the Fullcast this day. Where can people find you online? What have you been working on, and where are you going next?
If people would like more discussion of gender and sexuality in comics, though specifically superhero comics, by myself and a bunch of other super smart scholars, they should check out my edited anthology, Super Sex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero, available wherever fine books are sold on the internet. But if you buy it directly from the University of Texas Press website, it's usually a little bit cheaper. I think it's on sale throughout the summer. You can also find me on my now defunct but always classic podcast, Oh Gosh, Oh Golly, Oh Wow, which, as we discussed earlier, was a read-through an analysis of every issue of the classic Marvel Comics series Excalibur, originally by Chris Claremont and Alan Davis. Had some wonderful British comics scholars on that podcast at times, including Julia Round, whose book about Misty we mentioned earlier. You can find me on socials, Blue Sky, Anna Peppard, Twitter/X at Peppard Anna. You can find me over at Comics XF doing various things, and you can often find me contributing to a little website called Shelf Dust, where I most recently did a piece about the ecstasies of Jimmy Olsen, talking about Matt Fraction and Steve Lever's wonderful Jimmy Olsen series from several years ago. Again, speaking about representations of gender and sexuality, if you want more of that, I got you covered.
You remain one of my favorite comic critics. You cover any type of comic, any style of narrative. You cover, character histories, social studies, everything that you can think about. And it's always interesting to see what you've got to say next. So thank you very much for coming on to this show to talk about Devlin Waugh for a little bit. And hopefully we'll see you again at some point.
Thanks so much. And thank you for introducing me to Devlin. Hopefully it is a long and productive relationship.